Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and I'm so happy that it's March. I'm back again with my month-by-month series of rose care videos, and because the environment is warming up now, we have lots of activities to get to. Last month I started us in on the pruning, but now it's time to consider planting because the soil temperatures are warming up. So I'll go through that, I'll have a review of the pruning techniques that we talked about last month, and then we'll talk about the other considerations as we do in each of these videos. I put that up on the screen now with the timestamps of when we'll get into those various topics. Let's get a good look at what we're starting with here. This is an own root rose, a potted rose, ready to go in the ground. This was kept in my greenhouse, and this is from our own propagation. And you can see it hasn't lost all its leaves from the winter because it was kept in a greenhouse. This, on the other hand, is a grafted rose, and I want to show you an example of this as well, because this is what you may find in the garden centers more frequently this time of year, or at least in big numbers. This is grown in the US, and just to contrast them straight away, look at how big and thick this crown is, or the root base here is, and how thick some of these stems are. This is a grade 1.5, so this isn't even the largest size that's possible, and compare that to the thinness of the stems over here. All of that being said, this is on its own roots, so these tend to be the longer lived and healthier plants over time, but you'll get more instant results from a big beast like this. Now, showing you these ones here, what I will do is I'll cut them out of the bundle here, because there's actually 5 of them that came in the bundle there. See, yeah, I mean, this took some root pruning as it was pulled up from the field. It was stored, so maybe that's why they called it a grade 1.5 instead of a grade 1, because it does have big, thick stems on the top, but it looks like it lost some roots during processing. And they keep these in a cooler down in Texas or California, wherever they grow them, and have them ready for this time of year, at which point they start to have their little buds here come out. So this is ready to go in the ground. And one question you may have on some of these is, should you soak the roots? Now, during that process of them digging them out of the field, putting them into the cooler, they have taken pains to keep these roots nice and moist and ready. But as soon as they are unwrapped, as soon as they are unpacked from the box, these could dry out very quickly. So if they come out of the package nice and moist like this, I would feel free to just put them directly in the ground. But if you're going to sit on them for any length of time after unpacking them, giving them a soak, or at least ensuring that they get wrapped up again and maintain moisture around the roots, what you don't want to do is just leave them sitting on a bench like this for 4 hours in the sun and have those roots dry out. I'm here in the spot in the garden where I'm planning to plant this, and this is the one that I've chosen from the bundle, and from the 5 there, it was the one with the largest roots, which would always be my choice if I can see them. Now, what I do notice, and this didn't really play into it, is it's got a broken stem at the top here, and I'm going to use my pruners just to give that a clean cut off. It was broken down at the base here, and this just happened to be the one that had the sort of strap or the ID tag on the rose. And if I want to, I'm going to be identifying this anyway in my own way, but I want to, I can just take that and pull it around and put it onto a different stem. And in terms of pruning, some people will ask, well, should you prune these roses as they come in or before they go into the ground? And the answer is only if you see black stems that aren't helping the plant at all. If you see broken stems like the one that I just pulled off there, if you see dead or damaged or diseased or badly formed stems, yeah, get rid of them. I saw that one had some black on the top. This one's got some black on the tips as well. This one as well. And just a little cleanup like that. As for the roots, it's only the same thing. You're not looking to get rid of any of the bulk of the roots. If they've left roots on there for you, that's to your advantage. But if they are broken, and you give them a little side-by-side push like that, and if they just flop loosely and they're broken at the base, then you might want to remove that just so that there's not material to rot below the base. As for the planting method, I'm going to keep it simple for myself because there's really not that much to overthink here. I'm going to dig a hole and get it into the ground. Now, you notice that what I said at the beginning was that I didn't go ahead and soak it for any time before I planted it. That goes for those solutions like B1 vitamin or other supplements that they say you need to soak your roots in first. They make no difference. There's no scientific evidence to back that will help. So really, again, don't make it complicated for yourself. You're going to dig a hole as deep as you need to accommodate the roots of this. If the soil were really poorly drained or had heavy root competition, I might consider the spot, but this is going to be just fine. So getting back to that issue of how deep do I want to dig this hole, how deep do I want to plant this, the answer is, in terms of this crown, and actually I'm talking about this spot right here where the root portion meets the top portion. On a grafted plant like this, that's the graft union, but there's also a crown on own root roses. And for me, in my climate, that lands around ground level. Now, if you were, and I want to do that because I want to be able to keep an eye on the crown of that plant. I discussed the planting depth in a different video, and I'll link that here. But if you were in a colder climate, let's say you wanted to protect the lower stems here, you might sheet it a little bit lower, go 2 or 3 inches below the ground, and then even hill over winter to protect the crowns of your plant in colder climates. It doesn't tend to be necessary here, so I like to have it up where I can see the crown of the plant. So in terms of digging then, I have an idea. I'm going from the base of these roots up to here. So what's that? That's about a little over a foot. So that's what I'm going to try to dig. Okay, so I've got a reasonable depth of planting hole here, and I can tell that if I push this down into the hole, just hold it in a natural position here, that this crown is going to even up with the top of the soil there, which is kind of what I'm looking for. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to backfill with the native soil that I just pulled out of that hole. And now some people do talk about this step about putting a bunch of supplementation down there, and I disagree with that approach. Putting a whole bunch of organic manure or compost down into the bottom of this hole at this point here will actually make the planting hole more liable over time to settling or shrinking down as that organic matter breaks down. And as you can see, I'm trying to actually pack in the soil around the roots for support. That's one of the primary reasons for this medium in here. That's one of the primary functions of soil, is to support the roots. And by putting in organic matter, you may be giving them an immediate boost in terms of nutrients available, but the roots don't need that right now. The roots are actually dormant, and if they went into too hot of a soil with too much organic matter or too much nutrients, it isn't the best thing for them. So what I'm trying to do now is trying to get them accustomed to the soil that they'll actually be growing in, and I don't want a big difference between what's in the pot or in the planting hole here and what's the native soil around it. A big difference in density or composition of the soil inside the planting hole versus outside is not only going to constrain the roots or create a barrier for the roots, but also if you had poor drainage in your garden, this spot here with the different soil is going to become a natural spot for the moisture to accumulate. Basically, that planting hole becomes the drainage area for the whole garden. So don't try to improve your soil one pot at a time or one planting spot at a time. That's not really the way you should go with it. If your soil in general is acceptable for roses, then you should plant in your native soil. And if it's not acceptable for roses, you'll need to fix it at the garden level, not at the planting hole level. Now, you can see I'm doing a fair bit of tamping down, and I might even get up here and do a little step around. Now, you can see I'm not trying to give it a ton of pressure, but I am trying to restore it to the same density as the soil that surrounds it. So tamping down is trying to minimize that difference between the surrounding soil and the soil in the planting hole, and also to offer some level of support for those roots as they get into the ground there, so that the wind won't rock these around or it won't be dislodged by something small. Well, I'm going to dig another hole now for this one. This is the own root rose that I showed you, the potted rose. And while I'm doing it, probably because of the way I framed this shot, people are going to ask the question, why am I planting my mother roses into a tire? And fair question. I have a whole other video where I talk about the pros and cons at length, but let's suffice to say for this video that it offers some protection, primarily from our mower or string trimmer, but also from grass encroaching into the base of the plant. And so this is kind of useful for that. And yes, there are plenty of ways to do that in terms of weed barriers or sunken pots, but this happens to be very durable. It's going to last long in the landscape. It's a reused material, so we like it, but we're aware that some people have issues with how it looks cosmetically. So I may have overshot a little bit there. I'm trying to get the top of the plant into this range here, and yeah, that sounds about right. So here's what I'm going to do. Same method. I mean, it really is no difference except that this one is in a pot, right? So I settle it in there, I look and see, it might be a little bit low, so I push a little bit of soil down, give it a little compact to get that level right, and then try again. Yep, that looks about right. So now I'm going to go ahead and push the soil down. I'm doing a little teasing of the roots here, you can't see that, but just teasing the soil around the plant apart a little bit, and then pushing it in and compacting that native soil around it. Let's return to the topic of pruning, and yeah, I'm nowhere near finished. I'm working through the garden rows by rows, but I did want to review the technique with you as I described it last month. And the basics, if you'll recall, is to tackle the base of the plant, get rid of some of those oldest, crustiest stems for thinning and health purposes, and then overall tackle the shape and size. Speaking of shape and size, here's a beast. This one is probably 10 feet tall, 10 feet wide. It's an old garden rose called Chloris, an Alba rose. Thornless and gorgeous, but the advice that you'll typically get on old garden roses is to leave them. Don't do anything with them until after their bloom period, and then you can clean them up later in the summer. That way the old wood that they bloom on is not cut out in advance and you don't lose blooming for the year. Okay, so that's probably a well-reasoned bit of advice, but here's my question. If I took out 20% of the wood on this thing here, just thinned out some of the oldest, grossest, and maybe even the less productive wood, if I did that thinning now while I can see it, how much of that bloom would it really affect? In other words, am I going to be disappointed with a small percentage less blooming if it results in a healthier, better thinned, better shaped, overall more attractive shrub in the garden? So there is a case for going after old garden roses, at least lightly, during this time of year when they don't have their leaves on and you can see them more easily. So I'm not going to go to town on this. This will actually be a light pruning, thinning, and shaping, but you can see, first of all, that this section here that's extending out into the lawn. And normally I would start at the base, of course, but this actually is hanging over so much that getting it out of the way will help me to get underneath there a little bit. And you can see I'm just doing it as a very fast, practical trim, getting some of this material that's extending way too far out. And a rare treat, this is the thornless rose, so no thought of having to wear any gloves. Okay, down into this mess, and obviously this is a very congested rose, and I hope you can see this properly here, because I'm going to look at the color of the stem a little bit. And obviously this one is a bright young stem, and if I were any doubt, which I'm not in this case, I gave it a little scrape there and that turns out bright green. But if I go to this dark one here and I do the same scrape test, no matter how hard I scrape, all I get is dull brown underneath black. So obviously those are not good colors for the stems on your rose. I can remove this one here as low as I can possibly get it and still cost myself nothing in terms of blooms on the rose. So getting that out of there is only going to help the health of the rose. Now if I look for other ones with similar color, this one here, same thing. I can get rid of that as low as I want. It's just a dead stem. Well, I gave myself about 10 minutes of pruning time, and this is the pile I came up with. And while it does look substantial, when I look in the center here, you'll see that it is disproportionately those dark and damaged stems that I was targeting. So I don't feel badly at all. And when I look at the main shrub, again, I think you'll agree with me that there's still plenty of wood on there to bloom. Moving on now to the section on fertilizer and soil, let's talk a little more about alfalfa. Last month I introduced you to alfalfa as something that I apply to the roses as I'm waking them up, as I've done my pruning and my cleanup on those roses. Then I top dress them with the alfalfa. I water that in, work it into the top layer of the soil, usually about 1 cup per medium-sized rose. And sometimes if I'm doing a very large rose like the Climber Eden that I showed you in the video, I'll do 2 cups at the same time, or a large shrub would be fine. It would be too soon to reapply it to the things that I just did 2 weeks ago, but in any of the new ones that I'm pruning, I'm adding that cup of alfalfa as I go along, and then probably again I'll reapply in 4 to 6 weeks. Now, some people asked the obvious questions: where do I get alfalfa? And my first advice is always, if you're anywhere near a rural area, any place where they feed horses, look for those stores that they sell horse feed. Here it's in a lot of different stores, hardware stores like Rona have a section where they have horse feed. In our local community, also a pet store, Mr. Pets, does the same thing, but also Co-op, Buckerfields. I'm talking about Canadian stores here, but down in the States it'd be Tractor Supply or things like that. So you're looking for a place that sells horse feed, and the horse feed is just fine for it. Now that goes for roses that are established in the ground. The new ones that I'm planting, I don't need to feed them with anything yet. I don't need to put anything in that planting hole, and I don't top dress on top of the planting hole yet. Their first and only job at this point is to establish fresh new roots, and so that's what I'm leaving them to do. Now, one more talk about fertilizer here is, let's talk about those roses that are in containers and established in containers and coming back awake for the season. I don't really go with alfalfa for those. I usually take a blend of Osmocote or slow release fertilizer as well as liquid feed, and that's how I manage my nutrition in containers, just because the pots themselves don't have the same soil volume to get the same temperatures and consistency of moisture to release organic amendments so easily. It can be managed, but typically I find it much easier to handle with a slow release fertilizer and a top up application of liquid fertilizer through the season. Speaking now of roses in containers, let's move on to the section about watering, because while the roses in the landscape, and my assessment out there is that my soil has plenty of moisture in it. Here inside the greenhouse, and for those roses that you're taking out of, say, your garage or coming out of dormancy, if you start to see them leafing out, their watering needs are going to start to come way up. And obviously you'd talk about feeding them with that granular feed or that slow release, but now you have to start watering them. And one thing I wanted to point out is that as they come out of dormancy, you can almost predict their watering needs by how much foliage they have. Something like this that has been slow to come out of dormancy is going to have very, very different watering needs than something like this that's pushing a ton of new foliage. So direct your watering towards this, plants in containers, new plantings, sure, make sure there's enough moisture in the soil, and watering in that alfalfa as you feed your established roses, but that's about it. Lots of soil moisture out there in the landscape, at least in my climate. On to the video section now on propagation. I'm here in front of my hardwood cutting beds, getting a closer up look at those. These are fully ripened cuttings from last year's growth that I took during the months of December, January, and February when I was doing my initial pruning. Now it is getting a bit late for this, and I want to show you why here. I'll show you an example on this stem here. I hope it comes into focus on this, is that you can see that this stem is from last year's growth, but it's starting to send new shoots from the current year's growth, which means that it's going to expend its energy on sending new shoots and not so much on rooting. So it becomes an awkward stage now. Hopefully these got into the soil early enough and cool enough and can start to work on rooting before they shoot, but the stems that are on your plants right now are starting to think about shooting. So it is a bit of a lull in the propagation season, but don't worry, we'll get back to it as soon as these new shoots come up and become fully ripened or partially ripened stems from this year. We'll start working on that within the next 2 to 3 months, and there's plenty to do with your pruning and planting right now anyway. Quick discussion on pests and disease. This is a rose that we've already pruned back and cleaned up for the season, and you can see those bare stems that we've actually sprayed with lime sulfur are giving way now to fresh red buds, and what we don't want to see is we don't want to see them coexisting with old leaves that have disease, so we want them to come into the season as clean as we can possibly get it. Let me show you the opposite example. These roses in containers in my greenhouse came through the winter so nicely that in fact they did not lose all of their old leaves. And so what you can see here is I see powdery mildew, I see a little bit of black spot, and just generally scuzzy looking leaves held on the plant, when at the same time over here you can see fresh new red growth coming up on plants in very close proximity. And this is exactly what we're trying to avoid. We don't want that fresh growth coming up and being inoculated with the powdery mildew, black spot, and foliar diseases. So I'm gonna have to get in here and do a bit of a cleanup and separation of these roses to try to knock down or remove those scuzzy looking leaves.
This is the point in the video where I do a plant spotlight, and unfortunately with nothing really even leafed out, it's hard to imagine, but at least I have pictures. This is a plant called Variegata de Bologna. Very beautifully striped, oh so photogenic. Now one thing, you do take the good with the bad. It is a bit vulnerable in my climate here because we're wet to having foliar disease like black spots. So early on I do a great job of cleaning it up. It is so showy, but I'm not surprised when it comes down with some black spot even early in the season, June, and then I have to basically strip off all the foliage and hope it comes back clean for more flushes of flowers. If you're not looking for something that has quite so much garden charm, let's say, or vulnerability to black spot, if you want to choose a different kind of a striped rose, let me suggest Scentimental is another one that you could look at, more modern and less vulnerable to this kind of disease. Or one of my personal favorite striped ones, it's a mini or small floribunda called Pandemonium. I'll put a picture of that one in as well. All right, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do stick around as I get these guys to come into bloom. We start talking about deadheading and additional fertilizing and care throughout the season, and I'll be back to see you with our edition for April.